March 27, 1914, early morning. Biltmore Estate, Asheville, North Carolina. A thin mist hangs low over the French Broad River, drifting upward toward the limestone walls of the largest private house ever built in America. The chimneys of Biltmore House rise into the gray sky like watchtowers from a fallen kingdom. Inside, the corridors are already awake. Servants move quietly across marble floors, carrying trays, opening shutters, stoking fires in rooms that will soon be empty. But there's no master to receive them. George Washington Vanderbilt II is dead. He was 51 years old. Pneumonia took him in Washington, D.C. with no warning and no time for farewells. By the time the news reaches Asheville, the house he built for eternity has already become a financial liability of terrifying proportions. 250 rooms, thousands of windows, acres of roof, a small city that consumes money even while standing still. For the first time since its completion in 1895, Biltmore has no patriarch. What remains is a widow and a child. Edith Vanderbilt is 41 years old. Her daughter Cornelia is 13. Overnight, Edith inherits not just grief, but a structure designed to defeat its owner. Biltmore was never meant to be practical. It was conceived as a private refuge for a cultivated man who believed that wealth could be used to carve out a corner of Europe in the mountains of North Carolina. Every carved stone, every imported tapestry, every fireplace large enough to stand inside speaks the same language, permanence. But permanence is an illusion when the man who paid the bills is gone. Outside these walls, America is changing at speed. In 1913, the federal income tax becomes law. Estate taxes are no longer theoretical threats whispered among lawyers. They are immediate and brutal. Public sentiment is shifting as well. The age of unquestioned industrial aristocracy is ending. The word Vanderbilt still commands all, but it also attracts scrutiny, resentment, and political appetite. Biltmore does not generate income. It generates expenses. Heating alone costs more than many families earn in a lifetime. Hundreds of employees depend on a household that suddenly has no clear future. The house does not mourn. It simply demands. Edith Vanderbilt stands inside this monument to her husband's dream, and the scale of the problem is almost absurd. There is no instruction manual for widowhood at this level of excess. She was not raised to dismantle empires or manage collapsing estates. She was raised to host, to converse, to support a vision that was never hers alone. Yet the vision has outlived its creator. And now it turns on her. Biltmore, once a symbol of cultured restraint and intellectual ambition, becomes something else entirely. A test, a trap, a question carved in stone. Can beauty survive without the fortune that created it? Or does it die the moment the money stops flowing? Most houses disappear quietly. They are sold, stripped, subdivided, forgotten. Biltmore should have followed that path. Every economic force of early 20th century America is aligned against its survival. This is where the story should end. But it doesn't, because standing alone in a house that was never meant to be inherited is a woman who will refuse the most logical outcome. The preservation of Biltmore does not begin with confidence or strategy. It begins with shock, silence, and the sudden understanding that if nothing is done, this palace will outlive its purpose by only a few years. And the person least prepared to save it is the only one left who can. To understand why Biltmore stood on the edge of extinction the moment George Vanderbilt died, we must go backward to a decision that was never rooted in logic, only in temperament. The story of Biltmore does not begin with ambition in the industrial sense. It begins with a young man who inherited unimaginable wealth and felt no hunger to multiply it. George Washington Vanderbilt II was not his grandfather Cornelius, the ferocious architect of a transportation empire, nor his uncles who treated railroads and steel mills like chessboards. George was a reader, a collector, a man who believed that civilization was something to be cultivated quietly, far from crowds and markets. He read thousands of books, spoke several languages, and preferred conversation about art and philosophy to balance sheets. In a family that measured worth in expansion, George measured it in refinement. That difference would shape everything that followed. By the late 1880s, George had already retreated from New York's social gravity. He wanted air, distance, and control over his surroundings. His choice of Western North Carolina was not accidental. The Blue Ridge Mountains offered isolation without obscurity, elevation without remoteness. It was a landscape untouched by the industrial scars he despised in the Northeast. Here, George did not plan to build a business. He planned to build a sanctuary. In 1888, he began quietly acquiring land near Asheville, eventually assembling more than 125,000 acres. This was not land meant for speculation. It was land meant to be shaped, curated, and sealed off from time itself. When George commissioned architect Richard Morris Hunt, the message was clear. This was not to be an American house. It was to be a European estate transplanted wholesale onto American soil. Hunt, the dean of American Beaux-Arts architecture, understood immediately. The design would borrow from the chateaux of the Loire Valley, particularly those built not for defense, but for pleasure and contemplation. Limestone walls, steeply pitched roofs, sculpted dormers, and a plan that favored symmetry and procession over efficiency. This was architecture as statement, but not the vulgar statement of wealth. It was a statement of taste, of lineage, of withdrawal from the modern world rather than conquest of it. Yet architecture was only one half of the experiment. To shape the land itself, George turned to Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who had already redefined how Americans understood nature through Central Park. Olmsted did not see wilderness as something to exploit. He saw it as something to discipline. At Biltmore, he designed not a garden, but an ecosystem. Forests were to be scientifically managed, farms integrated into the landscape, and vistas carefully composed so that every view felt inevitable. Olmsted believed Biltmore could be a model of responsible land stewardship. George agreed. But stewardship is not the same as profit, and therein lay the flaw. Construction began in earnest in 1889 and consumed 6 years. Thousands of workers labored to raise the house, install miles of plumbing, wire the estate for electricity, and import materials from across the Atlantic. Biltmore House was equipped with the most advanced technology of its time: electric lighting, central heating, elevators, refrigeration. It functioned like a private city, but unlike a city, it produced nothing. Every dollar spent vanished into permanence. By the time the house was completed in 1895, its cost was astronomical, even by Vanderbilt standards. And George did not stop there. He filled the house with tapestries, paintings, furniture, and a library of over 10,000 volumes. Biltmore was not built to impress visitors. It was built to satisfy a singular mind. This distinction matters. Other American mansions of the Gilded Age were often tied, however loosely, to commercial ecosystems. They were showcases near financial centers, places where deals were made and influence was exercised. Biltmore was different. It was deliberately removed from economic circulation. George Vanderbilt did not host endless balls. He did not seek crowds. His guests were chosen carefully. Writers, diplomats, thinkers. Biltmore was a monastery of culture masquerading as a palace. It was designed to consume wealth slowly and endlessly, like a controlled fire. George believed his fortune was inexhaustible. In purely numerical terms, he was not entirely wrong. The Vanderbilt family wealth, generated by railroads and shipping, seemed eternal at the turn of the century. But George made one critical assumption: that the structure of American society would remain friendly to inherited excess. It would not. The very forces that created the Gilded Age were already undermining it. Progressive politics, labor unrest, and the growing idea that extreme wealth carried social obligations were gaining momentum. George saw himself as insulated from this shift by geography and taste. Biltmore was far from Washington, far from Wall Street, far from criticism. Or so he believed. What George did not do is as important as what he did. He did not establish a sustainable revenue model for the estate. The farms were productive, but not designed to offset the full costs of the house. The forests were managed responsibly, but profit was secondary to experimentation. Biltmore was not a business disguised as a home. It was a home disguised as a worldview. George paid the bills personally, drawing from family wealth that he did not generate and did not feel compelled to grow. The house existed because he existed. That was its only true foundation. In 1898, George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. Their marriage was intellectual, restrained, and sincere. Edith understood Biltmore as George did, not as an asset, but as a refuge. Together, they hosted modest gatherings, walked the grounds, and raised their daughter Cornelia within an environment designed to feel timeless. But time does not stop. By the early 20th century, cracks began to appear in the logic of the estate. Maintenance costs rose. Labor became more expensive. The world beyond the mountains grew louder and more hostile to symbols of inherited privilege. George Vanderbilt did not adapt. He believed that refinement itself was justification enough. When George Vanderbilt died suddenly in 1914, he left behind something extraordinary and something fatal. Biltmore was complete, beautiful, and utterly unprepared to outlive its creator. There were no contingency plans, no financial mechanisms designed to protect the house from changing laws or public opinion. George had built a dream that functioned perfectly as long as he was alive to sustain it. In death, that dream revealed its true nature. Biltmore was not an inheritance. It was an obligation of staggering scale. This is the quiet tragedy embedded in the stone and timber of the estate. George Vanderbilt did not fail. He succeeded too purely. He built exactly what he wanted, without compromise, without regard for durability beyond his own lifetime. Biltmore was the physical manifestation of a man who believed that wealth could be converted into permanence through taste and care alone. He underestimated history. He underestimated politics. And most critically, he underestimated the cost of survival once beauty is separated from the fortune that created it. When Edith Vanderbilt inherited Biltmore, she did not inherit a legacy designed to endure. She inherited the aftermath of a perfect dream colliding with a world that no longer had patience for it. The weeks following George Vanderbilt's death were consumed by ritual, correspondence, and silence, but beneath the formal mourning, another reality was already asserting itself. Death did not pause the machinery of Biltmore. Coal still had to be delivered. Roofs still leaked. Wages still had to be paid to hundreds of workers whose livelihoods depended entirely on an estate that now had no economic anchor. Edith Vanderbilt returned to Asheville not simply as a widow, but as the legal and moral center of an operation that bled money by the hour. The scale of it was staggering. Biltmore House alone required constant maintenance to prevent deterioration. The estate's farms, forests, and villages required oversight. This was not grief in private. This was grief under pressure, with clocks ticking and invoices piling up. At the center of the crisis was a number that few outside the family fully understood at the time: the estate tax. In 1913, just 1 year before George's death, the United States ratified the 16th Amendment, permanently establishing the federal income tax. That same political climate produced new inheritance and estate taxes aimed squarely at fortunes like the Vanderbilts. For decades, America's great industrial families had lived as though wealth could pass untouched from one generation to the next. That assumption collapsed almost overnight. When George Vanderbilt died, a significant portion of his wealth was immediately exposed to taxation. And unlike more liquid fortunes, much of his value was tied up in land, buildings, and objects that could not be easily sold without destroying the estate itself. Edith Vanderbilt was suddenly responsible for a financial puzzle with no obvious solution. The estate's operating costs were immense, yet its income was modest. Agricultural operations brought in some revenue, but nowhere near enough to sustain the house. Timber sales were limited by George's commitment to scientific forestry, which prioritized regeneration over aggressive profit. Selling land would provide immediate relief, but at the cost of dismantling the carefully designed environment that gave Biltmore its meaning. Every option carried consequences, and none of them were reversible. Compounding the problem was Edith's position in society. She was expected to grieve quietly, to preserve dignity, to maintain appearances. The idea of a Vanderbilt widow openly restructuring finances or making ruthless decisions was culturally uncomfortable. Women of her class were not trained for financial command. Edith had been educated, observant, and intelligent, but she had never been encouraged to think like an executive. Yet there was no alternative. Trustees could advise, lawyers could explain, but the decisions would ultimately be hers. Biltmore did not need a figurehead. It needed leadership. The first reckoning came quickly. Maintaining the full scale of Biltmore, as George had run it, was impossible. Edith understood this not as a failure but as a fact. The estate had been designed around a single man's vision and income stream. That man was gone. Within months, she began making choices that would have been unthinkable during George's lifetime. Staff numbers were reduced. Certain wings of the house were closed off to limit heating and maintenance costs. Social life at Biltmore was curtailed almost entirely. The house shifted from a lived-in palace to something quieter, more contained, more defensive, but these measures were only temporary relief. The larger threat was structural. Taxes would not stop. Maintenance costs would rise. The longer Edith attempted to preserve Biltmore exactly as it had been, the more vulnerable it became. Many families in similar positions chose liquidation. Mansions across the Northeast were sold, demolished, or converted into institutions. Europe itself was filled with aristocratic estates hollowed out by modern economics. The sensible choice would have been to sell Biltmore, while it still held symbolic value. That path was open. Buyers existed. But Edith Vanderbilt did not take it. Her resistance was not sentimental alone. Edith understood something crucial that George had not fully addressed. Biltmore's value was not only in its materials or acreage. It was in its uniqueness. There was no other private estate of its scale, coherence, and cultural ambition in America. Selling it piecemeal would destroy that uniqueness. Selling it whole would remove it entirely from the Vanderbilt story. Edith's task, whether she named it or not, was preservation through transformation. The question was how. As Edith settled into her role, the outside world grew more unstable. In 1914, Europe descended into war. By 1917, the United States would follow. Wartime economies are hostile environments for excess. Labor shortages emerged. Materials became more expensive. Public scrutiny of wealth intensified. Large estates were increasingly framed as symbols of inequality rather than achievement. Edith was navigating not just personal loss and financial strain, but a shifting moral landscape that questioned the legitimacy of everything Biltmore represented. One of Edith's most difficult challenges was reconciling George's ideals with survival. He had believed deeply in stewardship, in restraint, in the idea that land should be improved rather than exploited. Edith respected that philosophy, but she could not afford to treat it as sacred. Survival required compromise. Timber sales increased. Portions of the estate were evaluated not for their beauty, but for their economic potential. These decisions were incremental and careful, but they marked a profound shift. Biltmore was no longer a philosophical project. It was an asset under siege. At the same time, Edith had to consider the future of her daughter. Cornelia Vanderbilt was still a child, but she was also the sole heir to an estate that could either secure her independence or burden her for life. Edith's choices were therefore generational. Every dollar saved or lost would shape Cornelia's future. This awareness added urgency to decisions that might otherwise have been delayed. Edith was not simply preserving a house. She was negotiating an inheritance that could not survive in its original form. What makes this period remarkable is how quietly it unfolded. There were no public declarations, no dramatic confrontations. Edith Vanderbilt worked through lawyers, accountants, and estate managers, absorbing knowledge at speed. She learned the language of balance sheets, tax law, and contracts not out of ambition, but necessity. In doing so, She joined a small, often invisible group of women of her era who became competent financial stewards, precisely because disaster left them no choice. History rarely celebrates this kind of adaptation, but without it, Biltmore would not have survived the decade. By the early 1920s, the direction was becoming clearer, even if the destination was not. Edith could not maintain Biltmore as a purely private residence forever. The numbers did not allow it. The estate needed a new relationship with the world beyond its gauge. This idea was radical. Opening a Vanderbilt home, even partially, to the public challenged everything the family represented. Privacy had been the point. Withdrawal had been the luxury. Yet isolation was now a liability. Edith began to consider something her husband never would have: visibility. As a form of survival. This shift did not happen overnight, and it was not embraced enthusiastically. It was a reluctant conclusion drawn from years of financial pressure and changing realities. Edith Vanderbilt stood at a crossroads defined by modernity. Either Biltmore adapted, or it disappeared. In choosing adaptation, she was not preserving George's dream in its original form. She was ensuring that some version of it would endure. Section by section, decision by decision, Edith was transforming a monument built for one man into an institution capable of outliving him. The true battle for Biltmore was no longer against debt alone. It was against irrelevance. By the mid-1920s, the question confronting Edith Vanderbilt was no longer whether Biltmore could survive as George had imagined it. That question had already been answered by arithmetic. The real question was whether the estate could survive at all without becoming something fundamentally different. For more than a decade after George's death, Edith had preserved the illusion of continuity. The house remained private. The gates remained closed. The rituals of a great estate continued in diminished form. But beneath that surface, the financial ground was eroding. Taxes rose steadily. Maintenance costs climbed with inflation. The world that had once tolerated immense private estates was growing impatient with them. What Edith had been postponing was now unavoidable. Biltmore would have to justify its existence to the public, or it would cease to exist. The first cracks in absolute privacy appeared quietly. Portions of the estate's land were already gone. In one of the most consequential decisions of her early widowhood, Edith sold tens of thousands of acres of forest to the federal government, land that would later become part of Pisgah National Forest. This move was consistent with George's conservation ideals, but it was also a strategic concession. Selling land reduced tax burdens, generated capital, and preserved the core estate. It was preservation through subtraction. Yet even after these sales, Biltmore House itself remained a financial paradox. It was too large to mothball, too expensive to maintain, and too culturally significant to demolish. Edith had saved time, not solved the problem. At the same time, the Vanderbilt name was losing its untouchable status. By the 1920s, newspapers no longer spoke of America's industrial dynasties with uncritical reverence. The public mood was changing. Wealth was still admired, but it was increasingly interrogated. Extravagance without public purpose looked less like success and more like provocation. Edith understood this shift instinctively. She was not a political radical, but she was observant. If Biltmore were to survive, it would have to be reframed not as a symbol of exclusion, but as a cultural asset. The idea of opening Biltmore to the public was deeply uncomfortable. For decades, privacy had been the estate's defining feature. George had built Biltmore precisely to escape crowds, commerce, and spectacle. Allowing strangers to walk its halls would have felt to him like desecration. Edith knew this. She respected it. But she also knew that George's preferences could no longer dictate reality. The estate could not survive as a shrine to a single man's values if those values offered no path forward. Preservation now required reinterpretation. Even so, Edith did not rush. The decision matured slowly, shaped by caution and circumstance. The true catalyst was economic catastrophe. In 1929, the American stock market collapsed, and with it the illusion that private fortunes could remain insulated from national disaster. The Great Depression was brutal to estates like Biltmore. Income from investments shrank. Operating costs remained fixed. Public hostility toward wealth intensified. At the same time, unemployment soared and communities around Asheville suffered deeply. Biltmore, employing hundreds, became both a burden and a potential lifeline. Edith was painfully aware that closing or selling the estate outright would devastate the local economy. Survival was no longer just a family concern. It was a regional one. In 1930, Edith made a decision that marked a turning point in American cultural history. She opened the Biltmore Gardens to the public. For an admission fee, visitors could walk the grounds, view the landscape terraces, and experience a portion of the estate once reserved for the Vanderbilts alone. It was a cautious experiment, limited in scope, designed to test whether the public would respond with curiosity rather than hostility. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Visitors arrived in numbers that exceeded expectations, drawn not by resentment, but by fascination. Biltmore, it turned out, was not hated. It was desired, encouraged, but still wary. Edith took a far more radical step. Later that same year, Biltmore House itself was open to visitors. This was unprecedented. No private residence of such scale and intactness had ever been offered to the public in this way. The house was no longer merely a home. It became a destination, a museum, a living document of the Gilded Age. Rooms once heated for a handful of guests were now filled with strangers moving slowly, quietly absorbing a world that no longer existed anywhere else. This transformation was not cosmetic. It required structural change. Tours had to be designed, staff retrained, security reimagined. The house had to be protected not only from neglect but from admiration. Wear and tear became a new form of threat. Edith approached these challenges with the same restraint that defined her earlier decisions. She did not sensationalize Biltmore. She did not cheapen it. The presentation was controlled, dignified, educational. Visitors were not invited to gawk at wealth, but to witness a moment in American history preserved in full scale. Opening Biltmore to the public altered the estate's relationship with the world. It also altered Edith's role. She was no longer merely a widow defending a legacy. She became a curator, a steward of memory, responsible for shaping how future generations would understand the Gilded Age. This responsibility was immense. The narrative could easily slip into glorification or condemnation. Edith steered a careful middle path. Biltmore was presented neither as a moral triumph nor as a cautionary tale. It was presented as fact. Stone, wood, and intention frozen in time. The financial impact of opening the estate was significant. Admission fees provided a steady source of income that stabilized operations during the worst years of the Depression. Biltmore did not become wildly profitable overnight, but it became sustainable. For the first time since George's death, the estate generated revenue proportional to its scale. More importantly, it justified its existence in the eyes of the public and the state. A house that employed hundreds and welcomed thousands was harder to attack politically than a private palace hidden behind gates. There was, however, a personal cost. Privacy, once lost, could not be fully reclaimed. Edith retreated further into reserved spaces of the estate, surrendering rooms and routines that had once been hers. Biltmore was no longer primarily a home. It was an institution. This shift demanded emotional sacrifice as much as strategic foresight. Edith accepted it without public complaint. Her temperament was not theatrical. Her legacy would not be built on speeches or manifestos, but on outcomes. By opening Biltmore, Edith Vanderbilt did something extraordinary. She transformed a liability into a public trust without surrendering its integrity. She anticipated a model that would later be adopted by historic houses across America, long before preservation became a formal movement. At a moment when many estates were being dismantled, she chose exposure over erasure. In doing so, she ensured that Biltmore would not be remembered as a ruin of excess, but as a preserved artifact of ambition, taste, and contradiction. This was not the end of Biltmore's struggle, but it was the moment its fate changed direction. The house that had once existed to exclude the modern world now depended on it. Edith Vanderbilt had not saved Biltmore by clinging to the past. She saved it by accepting that survival required surrendering the very privacy that defined it. In that paradox lies the true measure of her achievement. By the early 1930s, Biltmore had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Once the gates were opened to the public, the estate ceased to be merely a private inheritance under strain and became something far more complex, a living enterprise built around memory, labor, and spectacle. This new identity brought relief, but it also introduced risks George Vanderbilt had never imagined. The house was no longer threatened by abandonment alone. It was now vulnerable to overexposure, misunderstanding, and the slow erosion that comes when beauty must pay for its own survival. Edith Vanderbilt understood this immediately. Saving Biltmore was not a single decision. It was an ongoing negotiation between preservation and necessity, between reverence for the past and accommodation to the present. The Great Depression intensified every pressure already bearing down on the estate. Although visitor admissions provided income, the national economy was unstable, and tourism was fragile. A single downturn in travel could unravel years of careful planning. Edith therefore refused to rely on the house alone. She expanded her vision outward, toward the land itself. Biltmore's farms, which George had conceived as experimental and educational, were reorganized with sharper economic purpose. Dairy operations were modernized. Crop yields were scrutinized. The estate's agricultural output became both a revenue stream and a public-facing symbol of responsibility. Biltmore was no longer only a relic of elite leisure. It was presented as productive, disciplined, and socially useful. This emphasis on usefulness was not accidental. During the Depression, private wealth survived politically only when it could demonstrate public benefit. Edith grasped this reality with instinctive clarity. Biltmore employed hundreds of local residents at a time when jobs were scarce. It maintained roads, housing, and infrastructure that supported entire communities. Edith made sure these facts were visible. The estate's survival depended as much on public goodwill as on ticket sales. In this sense, Edith was practicing a form of cultural diplomacy. She was teaching America how to tolerate Biltmore's existence in a world increasingly suspicious of inherited privilege. Inside the house, the transformation was equally delicate. Opening Biltmore to visitors required deciding what story the house would tell. Edith resisted the temptation to dramatize. There were no exaggerated narratives of opulence or scandal. Instead, the presentation emphasized craftsmanship, architecture, and intention. Rooms were preserved as they had been used, not staged for fantasy. The library remained a working testament to George's intellectual life. The banquet hall was shown not as a site of excess, but as a reflection of European tradition transplanted to American soil. In doing so, Edith subtly reframed the estate. Biltmore was not an insult to democracy. It was an artifact of a specific historical moment, worthy of study rather than condemnation. Yet this restraint came at a cost. Visitors arrived with expectations shaped by rumor and imagination. Some wanted spectacle. Others wanted moral judgment. Edith offered neither. The experience of Biltmore was intentionally quiet, even austere. This disappointed some, but it preserved the integrity of the house. Edith was not selling fantasy. She was selling continuity. And continuity requires discipline. Behind the scenes, the work was relentless. Every year brought new challenges. Roofs required repair. Stonework weathered. Mechanical systems aged. Unlike public museums supported by government funds or endowments, Biltmore depended on its own performance. A single failed season could undo years of careful stewardship. Edith maintained strict control over spending, often to the frustration of advisors who urged expansion or modernization. She refused to compromise the house's character for short-term gain. Souvenir shops were limited. Commercialization was restrained. Biltmore would survive as itself or not at all. Edith's leadership style during this period was quiet but absolute. She did not seek public recognition. She rarely gave interviews. Her authority was exercised through decisions, not declarations. This invisibility contributed to a historical misunderstanding of her role. For decades, George Vanderbilt was credited as the creator of Biltmore, while Edith was treated as its caretaker. In reality, George built the house, but Edith built its future. Creation and survival are different skills, and Edith mastered the harder one. As the 1930s progressed, another transition loomed. Cornelia Vanderbilt, raised within the vastness of Biltmore, had reached adulthood. Her relationship to the estate was complicated. For Cornelia, Biltmore was not a dream realized. It was a childhood environment too large to feel intimate, too public to feel secure. Edith recognized this tension. She understood that her daughter might not share her commitment to preservation at any cost. This awareness added urgency to Edith's work. Biltmore needed to become independent enough to survive generational change. In 1935, Edith made another decision that further stabilized the estate's future. She formally transferred operational responsibilities to a corporate structure, placing Biltmore's management on a more professional footing. This move reduced personal vulnerability and insulated the estate from individual preference. Biltmore was no longer tied solely to the life choices of its owners. It became an entity with continuity beyond any single generation. This was a profound shift. The estate crossed from personal legacy into institutional existence. World events soon tested the resilience Edith had built. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, global conflict once again reshaped priorities. During World War II, Biltmore House served an unexpected role, safeguarding priceless artworks from the National Gallery of Art while Washington, D.C. was considered vulnerable to attack. Masterpieces were quietly transported to Asheville and stored within the limestone walls George had built decades earlier. In a final irony, the house once criticized as excessive became a vault for national heritage. Edith's insistence on preservation had given America an unplanned refuge. This moment cemented Biltmore's transformation. It was no longer merely a Vanderbilt estate. It was a national asset. Edith did not publicize this role aggressively, but its significance was understood within cultural circles. Biltmore had proven its relevance beyond tourism. It had justified its survival not just economically, but symbolically. A house built for withdrawal from the modern world had become indispensable to it. By the time Edith Vanderbilt's health began to decline in the early 1950s, the outcome of her long struggle was clear. Biltmore would endure. It would not return to the private isolation George had envisioned, but it would remain intact, coherent, and meaningful. Edith had not preserved a frozen past. She had created a living framework capable of absorbing change without losing identity. When Edith Vanderbilt died in 1958, her passing did not trigger the crisis that followed George's death decades earlier. There was no sudden threat of dissolution, no urgent scramble for survival. That absence of chaos was her greatest achievement. Biltmore continued on, not because it was immune to pressure, but because it had been taught how to respond to it. The widow who inherited a financial nightmare left behind a functioning institution. Section by section, year by year, Edith Vanderbilt transformed Biltmore from an unsustainable dream into a durable reality. She did not save it by clinging to grandeur. She saved it by understanding limits. In doing so, she ensured that the largest private house in America would not become another cautionary ruin, but a rare example of how adaptation, restraint, and quiet resolve can outlast even the most extravagant ambition. By the time the Second World War ended, Biltmore had already lived several lives. It had been a private refuge, a financial burden, a public museum, and even a wartime vault for the nation's artistic treasures. What it had not yet become was stable in the modern sense. Survival through crisis does not automatically translate into permanence. Edith Vanderbilt understood this better than anyone. The post-war world was not a return to old norms. It was a new environment with new threats. Rising labor costs, changing travel habits, and the gradual aging of the estate itself posed challenges no less serious than those of the Depression. The question facing Edith in her later years was not how to save Biltmore from collapse, but how to ensure it would not slowly decay under the weight of its own scale. The end of the war marked the beginning of mass mobility in America. Automobiles became affordable, highways expanded, and leisure travel grew into a national habit. On the surface, this should have benefited Biltmore. More people could reach Asheville than ever before. But increased access brought increased expectations. Visitors no longer wanted silent observation alone. They wanted comfort, amenities, and interpretation. Historic houses that failed to adapt to this shift found themselves bypassed. Edith recognized the opportunity and the danger. Opening Biltmore had saved it once. Opening it thoughtlessly could destroy what made it worth saving. The estate responded cautiously. Infrastructure was improved, but not aggressively modernized. Parking areas were created at a distance to protect sight lines. Visitor circulation was carefully controlled to prevent congestion within the house. Interpretive materials were expanded, but language remained restrained and factual. Edith resisted theatrical storytelling, even as it became fashionable elsewhere. She believed Biltmore's power lay in its authenticity, not in dramatization. This restraint limited short-term popularity but protected long-term credibility. Behind the scenes, the physical challenges of maintaining a 19th-century megastructure intensified. Mechanical systems installed at the turn of the century were obsolete. Electrical wiring, plumbing, and heating required constant upgrading simply to remain safe. Every intervention posed a dilemma. Modernize too aggressively, and the house would lose historical integrity. Preserve too rigidly, and it would become uninhabitable. Edith approached these decisions pragmatically. She allowed invisible modernization where necessary while preserving visible surfaces. The goal was not fossilization, but continuity. This philosophy extended to staffing. The great domestic staffs of the Gilded Age were no longer feasible or socially acceptable. Biltmore could not be run as a private palace in a democratic post-war society. Edith oversaw a gradual transition from household service to professional preservation roles. Guides replaced footmen. Conservators replaced valets. This shift was subtle but transformative. Biltmore stopped functioning as a household and began functioning as a managed historic site. This distinction ensured its survival within modern labor structures. As Edith aged, questions of succession grew more urgent. Cornelia Vanderbilt, though deeply shaped by Biltmore, did not share her mother's attachment to the estate as a personal mission. She had lived much of her adult life elsewhere and viewed Biltmore less as a calling than as an inheritance complicated by history. Edith respected this distance. She did not attempt to impose emotional obligation. Instead, she focused on structures that would protect the estate regardless of individual sentiment. This is where Edith's most forward-looking decisions emerged. She strengthened governance frameworks, clarified ownership arrangements, and reinforced the estate's operational independence. These measures were unglamorous and rarely discussed, but they were essential. Many historic estates fail not because of sudden disaster, but because of unclear authority and generational drift. Edith anticipated this danger and neutralized it quietly. Biltmore would not depend on a single personality again. At the same time, Edith began to recede from daily management. This was not withdrawal, but delegation. She had spent decades absorbing knowledge, making decisions, and setting standards. Now she ensured that those standards were embedded in institutional culture rather than personal oversight. Managers were chosen for competence, not loyalty to family tradition. Preservation priorities were documented rather than assumed. This professionalization marked the final stage of Biltmore's transformation from private dream to enduring institution. The cultural climate of the 1950s presented a final irony. The very excess once criticized as immoral began to attract nostalgic fascination. The Gilded Age, long dismissed as vulgar, was reinterpreted as a period of artistic ambition and craftsmanship. Biltmore benefited from this shift, but Edith did not indulge it. She resisted romanticization just as firmly as she had resisted condemnation. Her presentation of the estate remained measured even as popular culture drifted toward spectacle. This consistency reinforced Biltmore's authority as a serious historical site rather than an amusement dot in her final years. Edith Vanderbilt rarely spoke publicly about her role in saving Biltmore. When asked, she minimized it. This modesty was genuine, but it also reflected her understanding of history. Individuals rarely control outcomes alone. Structures, decisions, and timing matter more than personalities. Edith had positioned Biltmore to align with those forces rather than resist them. That alignment was her greatest success. When Edith died in 1958, there was no dramatic reckoning. The estate did not teeter on the edge of insolvency. The gates did not close. The staff did not scatter. Operations continued with little disruption. For an institution born of extravagance, this quiet continuity was remarkable. It signaled that Biltmore had crossed the final threshold of survival. It no longer required rescue. It required maintenance. Looking back, the significance of Edith Vanderbilt's work becomes clearer with distance. She did not preserve Biltmore by freezing it in the past. She preserved it by allowing it to evolve without losing its core identity. She understood that permanence is not achieved by resistance to change, but by controlled adaptation. This insight separates monuments that endure from those that crumble. Biltmore stands today not because it was inevitable, but because it was managed. Edith Vanderbilt confronted a structure designed to outlive its usefulness and taught it how to remain relevant. Her legacy is not carved into stone or etched into plaques. It is embedded in systems, decisions, and standards that continue to operate long after her death. The widow who once faced ruin did not simply save a house. She redefined what survival looks like for inherited greatness in a modern world. With Edith Vanderbilt gone, Biltmore entered the most uncertain phase of its long life. Survival under a single, determined steward is one thing. Survival without that presence is another entirely. The decades following her death would test whether the structures she built were strong enough to withstand indifference, generational distance, and the relentless pressures of modern economics. This was no longer a story of rescue in the dramatic sense. It was a story of endurance, of whether a vision rooted in discipline rather than sentiment could persist when the person who embodied it was no longer there to intervene. Cornelia Vanderbilt. Cecil inherited not only the title to Biltmore, but the weight of its expectations. Her relationship with the estate had always been complicated. Raised within its walls, she experienced Biltmore less as a marvel than as an overwhelming presence. Unlike her parents, she had not chosen the estate. It had shaped her before she could define herself against it. By the time she inherited responsibility, she was a woman formed by a different century, one far less tolerant of inherited obligation. Yet Edith's planning left Cornelia with something crucial: options. Rather than dismantling Edith's work, Cornelia allowed the professional structures her mother had created to function. This restraint mattered. Many estates collapse not through malice, but through abrupt changes in direction after generational transfer. Cornelia resisted that impulse. She did not attempt to reclaim Biltmore as a private residence in the old sense. Nor did she radically commercialize it. The estate continued operating much as it had in Edith's final years, with incremental adjustments rather than sweeping reforms. Still, the world around Biltmore was changing rapidly. The post-war economic boom reshaped tourism. Travel became faster, louder, and more consumer-driven. Historic sites across America faced a choice: adapt to mass tourism or risk irrelevance. Biltmore walked a narrow line. Visitor numbers grew, but so did wear and operational costs. The estate's vast scale meant that even minor increases in attendance required proportional investment in preservation. The balance Edith had established was delicate and easily disrupted. One of the most significant developments during this period was the formal division of ownership among Cornelia's sons. Biltmore passed into the hands of a new generation with varying degrees of attachment to the estate. This fragmentation could have been fatal. Many historic properties suffer when ownership becomes dispersed, Priorities diverge and decision-making slows. Biltmore avoided this fate largely because Edith had anticipated it decades earlier. Legal frameworks limited impulsive change. Operational authority remained centralized. The estate functioned less like inherited property and more like a managed entity. Even so, the pressure to modernize intensified. Preservation standards evolved. Public expectations shifted. Visitors wanted deeper interpretation, more access, and greater comfort. At the same time, the cost of doing nothing rose steadily. Deferred maintenance threatened the very fabric of the house. Roofs aged, stone weathered. Mechanical systems reached the end of their useful lives. Each problem demanded capital. Each intervention required philosophical justification. How much change could Biltmore absorb before it stopped being itself? The answer emerged gradually through practice rather than theory. Biltmore invested heavily in behind-the-scenes conservation. Masonry was repaired using traditional techniques. Artworks were stabilized by trained conservators. Environmental controls were upgraded invisibly to protect interiors. These efforts were expensive and rarely visible to visitors, but they defined the estate's credibility. Biltmore was not merely maintaining appearances. It was preserving substance. At the same time, interpretation deepened. Tours expanded to include discussions of labor, land use, and historical context. The estate's story grew more complex, less celebratory. This evolution mattered. As historical scholarship advanced, simplistic narratives of wealth became untenable. Biltmore adapted by acknowledging its contradictions. It presented itself not as an unqualified triumph but as a product of its time, shaped by ambition, privilege, and consequence. This honesty strengthened rather than weakened public trust. Economic reality remained unforgiving. Biltmore required constant revenue growth to offset rising costs. This necessity led to careful diversification. Agricultural traditions were revived in new forms. Wineries, shops, and seasonal events were introduced with restraint. Each addition was debated not only for profitability, but for compatibility with the estate's character. The goal was sustainability, not spectacle. This approach echoed Edith's philosophy. Even as the context had changed, what distinguished Biltmore during these decades was continuity of intent. Many historic sites drift as leadership changes, their identities reshaped by short-term trends. Biltmore did not. Its evolution was slow, deliberate, and grounded in principles established long before. This continuity was not accidental. It was the product of institutional memory carefully cultivated over generations. Edith's influence persisted not through personality, but through policy. By the late 20th century, the results were visible. Biltmore had become the most visited historic house in America. Yet it had not sacrificed coherence. Visitors encountered not an amusement park, but a disciplined experience anchored in place and history. This achievement was rare. It reflected decades of cumulative decision-making that prioritized long-term integrity over immediate return. In this sense, Edith Vanderbilt's true legacy emerged only after her death. The test of her work was not whether Biltmore survived her lifetime, but whether it survived without her. That it did so speaks to the depth of her foresight. She had not merely solved a crisis. She had embedded resilience into the estate's structure. The story of Biltmore after Edith is not dramatic. There are no moments of sudden rescue or near destruction. Instead, there is continuity. Repairs completed. Budgets balanced. Policies refined. This quiet persistence is the most difficult form of success to achieve and the easiest to overlook. Yet it is precisely what Edith set out to create. Biltmore today stands as evidence that inherited grandeur need not be doomed to decay or vulgar reinvention. It can endure through careful governance, honest interpretation, and disciplined adaptation. The widow who once faced ruin understood this when few others did. Section by section, generation by generation, her decisions continue to shape an estate that has outlived the world that created it. As the 20th century drew to a close, Biltmore found itself confronting a paradox Edith Vanderbilt could never have fully anticipated. The estate was no longer fragile. It was no longer obscure. It was, by every measurable standard, a success. Millions of visitors passed through its gates. Its image circulated globally as a symbol of American grandeur. And yet success introduced its own form of danger. The more visible Biltmore became, the greater the risk that it would be flattened into spectacle, reduced to a backdrop for consumption rather than a site of meaning. Preservation was no longer threatened by insolvency alone. It was threatened by popularity. This was the era in which Biltmore's identity was tested most subtly. Historic preservation in America was becoming professionalized, standardized, and increasingly commercial. Sites competed for attention in a crowded cultural marketplace. The pressure to entertain grew stronger each year. Many historic houses responded by simplifying their narratives, emphasizing romance over complexity, excess over context. Biltmore could have done the same. The temptation was real. The house was vast, visually overwhelming, and easily marketed. But the legacy Edith left behind exerted a quiet restraint. Biltmore's leadership understood that the estate's greatest asset was not its size, but its coherence. Once that coherence was compromised, no amount of popularity could restore it. During this period, investment shifted toward long-term conservation on an unprecedented scale. Entire systems were rethought not to impress visitors, but to protect the building itself. Climate control became a central concern. Artworks, textiles, and woodwork required stable conditions that 19th century technology could not provide. Modern solutions were introduced carefully, concealed within walls and basements invisible to the casual eye. These interventions were expensive and yielded no immediate spectacle. Visitors rarely noticed them. But they ensured that Biltmore's interiors would not slowly destroy themselves under the pressure of time and foot traffic. At the same time, the estate's narrative deepened further. Interpretation expanded beyond architecture and family biography to address broader historical forces. The labor that built and maintained Biltmore was no longer peripheral to the story. The lives of craftsmen, servants, and local workers were acknowledged with increasing clarity. The estate's relationship to the surrounding region, its economic dominance, its role in shaping land use, its influence on Asheville's development became part of the conversation. This shift mattered. It repositioned Biltmore not as an isolated marvel, but as a participant in American history, subject to the same contradictions and consequences as any other institution. This willingness to complicate the story distinguished Biltmore from many of its peers. Rather than defending the Gilded Age reflexively, the estate allowed visitors to confront it. Grandeur was presented alongside cost, vision alongside privilege, preservation alongside exclusion. This balance was not always comfortable, but it was intellectually honest. It reflected Edith Vanderbilt's instinct that endurance depends on credibility. A house that pretends to be morally simple cannot survive sustained scrutiny. Economic diversification continued cautiously. The estate's agricultural heritage, long central to its identity, was reinterpreted for a modern audience. Vineyards expanded, drawing on the land's potential in ways that aligned with its history of experimentation. Hospitality offerings grew, but remained spatially and conceptually distinct from the historic core. Biltmore did not transform the house into a hotel or event venue. The line between preservation and commerce was maintained with discipline. Revenue supported conservation. Conservation justified revenue. The relationship remained reciprocal rather than exploitative. As visitor numbers climbed, so did debates about capacity. Every historic site faces a limit beyond which preservation becomes impossible. Biltmore's scale allowed it to absorb large crowds, but not without consequence. Foot traffic wore floors. Breath altered humidity. Human presence introduced constant stress. The estate responded not by chasing maximum attendance, but by refining flow. Routes were adjusted. Access was rotated. Certain areas were rested periodically. These decisions sacrificed short-term profit for long-term survival, a trade-off Edith would have recognized immediately. Public perception of Biltmore also evolved. It became a reference point in broader conversations about wealth, inheritance, and preservation. Critics questioned whether such estates should exist at all. Supporters argued that their preservation provided cultural value that transcended origin. Biltmore did not attempt to resolve this debate. It existed within it. By remaining open, transparent, and historically grounded, the estate allowed visitors to draw their own conclusions. This openness was itself a form of confidence. The turn of the 21st century brought new pressures. Digital media transformed how history was consumed. Attention spans shortened. Experiences became increasingly mediated through screens. Biltmore faced a choice: chase digital spectacle or reinforce physical presence. The estate chose the latter. While technology was used to enhance interpretation, it did not replace the core experience of moving through space, of encountering scale and material directly. This decision preserved what made Biltmore irreplaceable. No image or video could replicate the sensation of standing inside a room, designed to overwhelm quietly. Environmental awareness added another layer of responsibility. The estate's vast landholdings, once justified through stewardship alone, were now scrutinized through the lens of sustainability. Biltmore responded by reaffirming its conservation legacy. Forestry practices evolved. Agricultural methods adapted. The estate positioned itself not as a relic of environmental disregard, but as a long-term experiment in land management. This continuity with George Vanderbilt's original ideals filtered through modern science created a narrative arc that spanned centuries. Throughout these transformations, Edith Vanderbilt's presence remained palpable, though rarely acknowledged explicitly. Her decisions had set boundaries that later generations did not cross. Biltmore would not become a theme park. It would not become a hollow monument. It would not become inaccessible again. These principles guided every adaptation, even as circumstances changed. Edith had not preserved a specific moment in time. She had preserved a method of decision-making. What emerges from this period is a deeper understanding of what it means to save a great house. Preservation is not an act of freezing. It is an act of translation. Each generation must reinterpret purpose without erasing origin. Biltmore succeeded because it accepted this responsibility consciously. It did not cling to nostalgia or surrender to novelty. It navigated between them. By the time Biltmore entered the modern era fully, it had become something rare, a historic estate that functioned as both memory and organism. It remembered its past without being imprisoned by it. It adapted to the present without dissolving into it. This balance is fragile and must be renewed continually. That it exists at all is a testament to decisions made under pressure decades earlier, by a woman who understood that saving a house meant teaching it how to live. Section by section, century by century, Biltmore's survival reveals a truth often missed in stories of grandeur. The greatest threat is not collapse. It is success without restraint. Edith Vanderbilt did not merely save Biltmore from ruin. She saved it from becoming something empty. And in doing so, she ensured that the house would remain not just standing but meaningful. Long after the world that built it had passed away. By the time historians began reassessing Edith Vanderbilt's role with the distance of decades, a striking realization emerged. Biltmore did not survive because it was America's largest private house. It survived because it was governed, quietly and relentlessly, by a philosophy that rejected spectacle as a substitute for purpose. Section by section, ledger by ledger, Edith had transformed an aristocratic fantasy into an institution with moral gravity. And it is here, in this long aftermath of her most difficult decisions, that her legacy becomes fully visible, not in marble halls but in structural resilience. Edith never wrote a manifesto. She did not publish essays about stewardship or give lectures on preservation. Her philosophy is reconstructed from actions, from letters, from budgets that reveal priorities more clearly than words ever could. She believed that wealth, once inherited, ceased to be a private indulgence and became a responsibility. This belief was radical not because it was generous, but because it was disciplined. She did not give Biltmore away, nor did she hoard it. She held it in trust. Long before any legal trust existed, What makes this philosophy remarkable is the context in which it operated. Edith lived in a transitional moment in American history when old money was losing cultural authority, and new money had not yet developed a sense of obligation. The Gilded Age had collapsed under its own contradictions. Public sentiment toward inherited wealth was souring. Estates were increasingly seen as symbols of excess rather than achievement. Edith understood this shift instinctively. She realized that if Biltmore remained a private monument to privilege, it would eventually be dismantled by either economics or public resentment. Survival required legitimacy. Legitimacy, in Edith's worldview, came from usefulness. Biltmore had to justify its existence not through grandeur but through contribution. This is why the estate's relationship with its surrounding region mattered so deeply. She resisted the model of the isolated country palace. Instead, Biltmore functioned as an employer, an agricultural innovator, and eventually a cultural anchor. It provided work when work was scarce. It stabilized land when exploitation would have been easier. These choices were not romantic, they were strategic. Edith understood that a house which feeds no one will eventually be devoured. As generations passed, this ethic shaped how the Vanderbilt descendants approached inheritance. Unlike many old estates that fractured under family disputes, Biltmore remained relatively unified in purpose. This was not accidental. Edith's example established a moral framework that made reckless behavior socially unacceptable within the family. To squander Biltmore would not simply be financially foolish. It would be a betrayal of stewardship. In this way, her influence extended far beyond her lifetime. She created not just policies but expectations. This continuity proved essential. During moments of crisis, economic downturns, shifts in tourism, changes in cultural taste, each could have destabilized the estate. Yet time and again, Biltmore responded not with panic, but with recalibration. Expenses were adjusted. Offerings evolved. Core principles remained untouched. The house endured because it was not dependent on a single era's values. It had been designed, socially and economically, to outlive fashion. The academic reassessment of Edith Vanderbilt accelerated in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as historians began questioning traditional narratives that marginalized women's economic agency. Edith emerged as a case study in invisible power. She held no corporate title comparable to her husband's, yet she governed assets of extraordinary complexity. She navigated male-dominated financial systems without provoking resistance, precisely because she framed her authority as responsibility rather than ambition. This subtlety was her greatest strength. In preservation circles, Edith's approach increasingly came to be seen as prophetic. Many historic houses failed because they attempted to preserve appearance without preserving function. Edith preserved both. She allowed Biltmore to change roles from private residence to semi-public institution without losing coherence. This adaptability is now considered best practice in heritage management, but in Edith's time, it was unprecedented. Most widows retreated. Edith restructured. Her story also challenges the simplistic moral binaries often applied to the wealthy. She neither dismantled the system that created Biltmore nor indulged in it uncritically. She operated within its constraints, while redirecting its outcomes. This is why her legacy resists easy classification. She was not a revolutionary, but she was transformative. She did not reject wealth, but she refused to worship it. Biltmore itself became a teaching instrument. Students of architecture, landscape design, forestry, and preservation have studied the estate not only for its physical attributes, but for its governance model. The lesson is clear. Buildings do not survive on beauty alone. They survive when someone is willing to make unglamorous decisions repeatedly over long periods without applause. Edith's genius lay in her tolerance for thankless work. Public memory, however, is selective. Visitors admire the house, the gardens, the vistas. Few ask why it still exists when so many similar estates vanished. Fewer still know Edith's name. This anonymity is, paradoxically, the final proof of her success. She did not seek recognition. She sought continuity. And continuity rarely produces heroes in the popular imagination. It produces institutions. The irony is sharp. George Vanderbilt built more to express personal vision. Edith Vanderbilt preserved it by suppressing personal desire. His legacy is visible in stone. Hers is visible in survival. Together, they form a complete story: creation and endurance, aspiration and restraint. But without Edith, the story would end early, abruptly, and expensively. As debates continue about the future of historic estates in a world increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege, Edith Vanderbilt's choices feel newly relevant. She offers an alternative model. Not apology, not excess, but accountability. Biltmore exists today, not because it escaped judgment, but because it faced it and adapted. In this sense, Edith did more than save a house. She demonstrated how power can be exercised quietly, ethically, and effectively over time. She proved that stewardship is not passive caretaking, but active moral labor. And she left behind a structure capable of absorbing history rather than being crushed by it. Section 9, then, is not about walls or windows, but about the invisible architecture of values. The beams Edith installed were not limestone or steel. They were restraint, foresight, and an unwavering refusal to confuse ownership with entitlement. These supports have held for over a century, and as long as Biltmore stands adapted, inhabited, meaningful, they will continue to do so, bearing the weight of a legacy that was never meant to be loud, only lasting. In the final reckoning, when the noise of history fades and the grand gestures blur into pattern, the story of Biltmore resolves itself into something quieter and far more unsettling. The house still stands. The walls are intact. The gardens bloom. Tourists move through the corridors in steady streams, cameras raised, eyes wide. By every superficial measure, the battle was won. And yet the true conclusion of Edith Vanderbilt's story is not found in preservation alone. It lies in the question her life leaves behind. What does it mean to truly save something? Biltmore was never merely at risk of physical destruction. Fire, decay, bankruptcy, these were obvious threats, dramatic and visible. Edith confronted them, endured them, and overcame them. But beneath those dangers was another more insidious one: irrelevance. A great house that loses its reason for being does not collapse. It lingers. It becomes decorative, a shell. Edith understood this long before the language existed to describe it. She sensed that survival without meaning was a slower form of death. This is why the final phase of Biltmore's existence under her influence matters so deeply. By the time Edith's direct control ended, the estate had already crossed an irreversible threshold. It was no longer dependent on the personality of its owner. It had become an organism with systems, obligations, and a defined moral purpose. This transformation is rare. Most historic houses remain frozen expressions of individual will. Biltmore evolved into a structure that could outlive will itself. Edith's genius was not that she preserved George Vanderbilt's dream unchanged. She allowed it to be corrected by reality. She accepted that the original vision, grand, isolated, aristocratic, was unsustainable in a democratic industrial nation. Rather than resisting that truth, she negotiated with it. She preserved the physical manifestation of the dream while altering its social contract. The house remained magnificent, but it ceased to exist solely for itself. In doing so, Edith repositioned Biltmore within American culture. It stopped being an anomaly and became a reference point. It demonstrated that inherited wealth could be redirected rather than dismantled. That legacy could be reinterpreted without erasure. This was not redemption in a moral sense. It was reconciliation. Edith reconciled excess with responsibility, permanence with change. Her story also forces a reconsideration of power. Edith wielded enormous influence without spectacle, without rhetoric, without confrontation. She worked through continuity rather than disruption. In a historical narrative that often privileges dramatic figures and decisive moments, her method appears almost invisible. And yet, invisibility was her strategy. By avoiding conflict, she avoided collapse. By refusing to dominate the narrative, she ensured it could continue. This has implications far beyond Biltmore. Across the United States and Europe, great houses fell not because they were attacked, but because no one adapted them thoughtfully. Heirs fought. Caste spiraled. Purpose evaporated. Edith offers a counterexample. She shows that stewardship is not about preserving an owner's ego. It is about preserving relevance across generations that will not share that ego. There is also a deeply human dimension to this conclusion. Edith did not save Biltmore from a position of abundance. She saved it from within loss. Widowed, burdened by responsibility, and isolated within a social world that offered her little institutional authority, she chose endurance over escape. Many in her position would have sold, fled, or withdrawn. Edith stayed, and staying in this case was the hardest choice of all. The house itself bears silent witness to this endurance. Its rooms no longer echo with the expectations of a single family line. Instead, they absorb the footsteps of strangers, each bringing their own interpretations, questions, and judgments. This openness is not accidental. It is the final stage of Edith's strategy. A house that belongs emotionally to no one can belong meaningfully to many. Critics sometimes argue that Biltmore's continued operation as a cultural site still represents an unequal distribution of resources, that its beauty is inseparable from the economic structures that created it. They are not wrong. Edith did not dismantle those structures. But she did something arguably more difficult. She prevented them from remaining static. She forced them to justify themselves continuously. The result is a legacy that resists closure. Biltmore is not a solved equation. It is an ongoing negotiation between past and present, wealth and responsibility, admiration and discomfort. This tension is not a flaw. It is the point. Edith preserved not certainty, but dialogue. As time moves forward, new generations will reinterpret Biltmore again. Climate pressures, cultural shifts, economic realignments, all will test the estate anew. Edith's solutions will not always apply, but her approach will. She did not leave behind instructions. She left behind a mindset. Adapt without surrendering meaning. In this sense, Edith Vanderbilt did not merely save Biltmore. She changed the criteria by which saving is measured. Success was no longer defined by ownership, exclusivity, or untouched preservation. It was defined by continuity with conscience, by the ability of a place to remain relevant without betraying itself. The house on the hill in Asheville still commands the landscape, just as George Vanderbilt intended. But its true power no longer comes from dominance. It comes from endurance. From the fact that it is still there, not as a fossil, but as a functioning part of cultural life. That endurance belongs to Edith. When history looks back, it will likely continue to celebrate George Vanderbilt as the dreamer who built Biltmore. But quietly, inevitably, it will come to understand that Edith Vanderbilt was the one who decided whether that dream deserved to survive. And survival, as she proved, is not granted by wealth alone. It is earned through restraint, foresight, and the courage to change what you love so that it can outlive you. In the end, Biltmore stands not as a monument to excess, but as a case study in responsibility. Its continued existence is an argument made in stone, timber, and policy. An argument that says legacy is not what you build when you are powerful, but what you protect when power begins to slip away. That is the final truth of this story. Edith Vanderbilt did not fight ruin with grandeur. She fought it with patience. And patience, applied over decades, proved stronger than any fortune.